All right, so now that we have established how photosynthesis and cellular respiration are a big part of an ecosystem, these two processes depend on one another, and we just recently completed our projects on how they depend on each other. We can't have one system without the other, or one process, I should say, without the other. So now let's see how this weaves into an entire ecosystem. So as we said, there are a few different roles within an ecosystem. So you'll see that every organism that we have been studying throughout this unit, planarian, sea stars, jellyfish, the trout, aloe vera, morel truffle, strep, all of these different organisms, every single one has a role in the movement of energy through an ecosystem. And the role that they have is determined by how they obtain their energy and how they interact with other living things in the ecosystem. So this is where those roles of producer, consumer, and decomposer come in. So we're going to find out in a moment, were we correct where we placed our organisms? All right, so we have our producers as part of our ecosystem. These guys are responsible for this photosynthesis. So we've just spent a great deal of time on finding out how organisms photosynthesize. So they're using that sun's energy to help make food to gain energy. Can anybody remind us what else besides the sun's energy needs to be in a producer to get photosynthesis going? What are the other two things that have to be in the body? What's one of them, Maggie?
Water.
Water is one of them, and the other thing is what, Lori? Carbon dioxide, great. So both those things need to be in the body so that sun's energy can help break it up and make the food, the glucose, for the organism. So we know that plants really are responsible for a lot of photosynthesis, but who can remember what organelle is in the bodies of organisms that photosynthesize? Because it's not just plants that can do this. Isabel? It's a chloroplast, good. So algae, that's a protist, has chloroplast in it. There's even some bacteria that have chloroplast. And if you remember from our videos the other day from the science researchers that were studying climate change, what did they say is responsible for a lot of the photosynthesis on Earth? Does anybody remember? Some another organism. Phytoplankton. Logan, what are you doing?
Something like the water.
Right, and that's what it was, the phytoplankton that was in the ocean. So these little microscopic plants in the ocean are responsible for a lot of the photosynthesis that takes place on Earth. So energy enters most ecosystems as sunlight, and then it gets converted into the sugar and starch molecules by producers. So we know that the sunlight is really the ultimate energy source. That's how it's getting everything going. And then that sunlight is what's breaking up that carbon dioxide and water to make it into that sugar or that glucose so that it's available for other organisms. So when I'm saying those other organisms, I'm talking about consumers, right? These guys cannot photosynthesize, so they do not have chloroplasts in their body. These guys have to obtain their energy by feeding on other organisms. And there's different types of consumers. There's herbivores. These guys are only eating plants, so caterpillar, cattle, deer. A lot of you use these in your projects. So when you had your posters of your plant and your organism that was working together to survive, a lot of you use things like caterpillars, cattle, deer. Some of you use bunny rabbits. Some of you had pandas, giraffes, gazelles. I had all sorts of stuff. But yeah? Ostrich. Okay. So there are carnivores, is another type of consumer. And these guys eat only plant animals. So there's things like lions, spiders, snakes. Well, let's remember that even though they're eating just animals, indirectly they're eating a plant because something that they ate a plant, or something that they ate something that ate a plant, right? We can trace it back all the time to something that ate either a plant or some sort of photosynthesizing producer. And then there are omnivores, which would include things like us, goat, a crow. These are other examples that eat both plants and animals. And then finally, scavengers are another type of consumer. Not to be confused with decomposer. A lot of people confuse these two. A scavenger, yes, eats dead organisms like a decomposer does, but the difference is the scavenger is just consuming these things for its energy needs. So when a catfish or a vulture is feeding off of something dead, It's just eating it to get the energy it needs for itself. Whereas a decomposer, not only are they eating the dead things, but then they're taking those dead things and breaking down those parts of them so it can be returned back to the earth and used again, which we're going to learn in a future lesson to make sure we understand how that stuff that's getting broken apart can be used once again for the producers in photosynthesis. So energy is transferred to each of these organisms that eats a producer, then it goes to other organisms that feed on these consumers. So it's one big chain, which we're going to see in our activity right now. Let's take a look. So now that we've done this activity, we should recognize that this is what we were mimicking as we did that. How many of you remember seeing something like this before? Okay, so we call this an energy pyramid because it's showing the energy flow throughout an ecosystem. So the very first time we did the activity, like I said, we had 12 blades of grass, 6 grasshoppers, 3 moles, 1 owl, okay? This way, everybody got what they needed. So we had enough for the grasshoppers, enough for the moles, enough for the owls. So this is a perfectly balanced ecosystem where we've got this nice pyramid shape, the most amount of producers, and then we get gradually less and less of the other consumers up the chain. You'll also notice on the side the amount of energy that's available at each level. This has a lot to do with why it needs to be in this pyramid shape. You see this letters KCAL, that's called kilocalories. That's a measurement of energy. So you see at producer level, we have 1,000 kilocalories. Whereas we go up the rest of the chain, it gets less and less and less. By how much? Those of you that are math minds who can tell us how much is being used up each time we go to each level here. Sean?
It's like dividing by 2.
It is. So the organisms are using what percent of the energy?
20%.
They're using 90%. Because there's 10% that's actually left over for the next level. So we've got 90% being used by the organism itself, so as it travels to the next level, there's only 10% left over. So by the time we get to the grasshopper level, there's only 100 kilocalories available. By the time we get to the moles, 10, and by the time we get to the owl, 1. So that can really create a problem, especially when things don't work out in the perfect balance in nature. So the second time around, we were doing 6 blades of grass, but we still had 6 grasshoppers, we still had 3 moles, we still had 1 owl. This time around, we started to see a lot of death because there wasn't enough energy to go around for the different organisms. So let's take a look at page 50 in our book, because this helps explain a little bit more of what's going on with our energy pyramid. So there's page 50, there's a book that's Energy and Organisms on your table. These are going to be a class set, so we're not going to be taking them home with us, but you always have the option to sign one of these out if you need to. So after reading that on page 50, this should help sum that up. So in an energy pyramid, we've got showing the amount of energy that moves from the feeding level to another in a food web. So one amount of energy going to the next to the next. The organisms at each level use some of the energy to carry out their life processes. So you can remember, how much energy did we say is being used each time? So as you go up the pyramid, how much is being used for each of the organisms? Sean? 90%, right? So that means there's 10% left over for the next level. So most energy is available at the producer level because that's where the first input of energy comes, from that sunlight energy. And that hasn't been used by anything else yet. So the producer gets 100% of that energy and then uses 90% of it, and 10% is left over for the next group. So that amount of energy in the producer level is really going to limit the number of consumers the ecosystem can support. So that's why we have this pyramid shape. Those producers at the base are supporting all other life. So thinking back to when we did the activity where I cut half of the producers away, we started to run into issues. We weren't able to support the rest of the consumers in the ecosystem. So we need that balance with the majority producers in the ecosystem and then the others less and less as we go up the chain of life. So at the top, there's going to be usually a lot fewer of those guys. So fewer organisms at the highest level of that food web. So going back for a moment, we did skip the decomposers on purpose because we didn't necessarily see them as part of this energy pyramid. And we're going to spend actually a whole day just on decomposers themselves because they have a really important job within the ecosystem, but we don't see it within this pyramid, where they're responsible for breaking down the waste in the dead organisms and returning these things back to the environment to be used again for other organisms. So when I say returning back nutrients, we're talking about not just nutrients, but all of these other components that we've been learning about in photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Because you want to remember, when an organism is dead, it still has stuff left over in its body, right? They were going through cycles right before it died. So in a dead body, there's going to be leftover glucose, right? There's going to be leftover food there. There's also going to be leftover oxygen in a dead body. There's going to be leftover carbon dioxide in a dead body. There's going to be leftover water in a dead body. So all of those things are there, and those decomposers are going to break those molecules apart. Very similar to how we saw the light energy broke apart those molecules in photosynthesis, or in the Deer system, how it broke apart those molecules in cellular respiration. Decomposers have a similar role where they're going to break those things apart so they can once again recombine for water, carbon dioxide, all the things we need to start photosynthesis again. So bacteria, fungus, these are examples of what decomposers could look like. So like I said, we will be going into more detail with those guys in a future lesson. But for now, this sums up and wraps up what you guys had learned last year about organisms within an ecosystem and their energy roles.